What if the very thoughts you trust most are the ones destroying your peace? The father of cognitive therapy, Beck, discovered something that revolutionized our understanding of human suffering. Most people believe their emotions are caused by external events, that happiness depends on circumstances aligning perfectly, that if only the world would cooperate, they'd finally feel at ease. But Beck uncovered a truth that shatters this assumption entirely. Your misery isn't created by what happens to you, but by a single systematic error in how your mind interprets reality. And here's what will keep you watching until the very end. Once you identify this error operating in your own consciousness, you'll never see your suffering the same way again. And more importantly, you'll possess the exact mechanism to dismantle it. Before we go deeper into this revelation, if you're serious about understanding the architecture of your own mind and want more content that cuts through the noise and gets to what actually transforms your experience, subscribe now and turn on notifications. This isn't theory. This is the operating system of human consciousness laid bare. The error Beck identified isn't obvious. It doesn't announce itself. It masquerades as truth, as reality itself, as the most reasonable interpretation of what's happening around you. This is why it's so devastating and why most people live their entire lives imprisoned by it without ever recognizing its presence. Beck called these automatic thoughts, but that clinical term doesn't capture the totality of what's occurring. What's actually happening is that your mind is running a constant beneath-awareness interpretation machine, taking neutral events and transforming them through a distorted lens into evidence of catastrophe, personal inadequacy, or impending doom. The error isn't that you think. The error is that you think what you think is real. Consider the architecture of a single moment of suffering. Someone doesn't text you back. That's the event, raw and neutral, containing no inherent meaning whatsoever. But between that external fact and your emotional response, something happens so quickly you don't even notice it. Your mind generates an interpretation. They're angry at me. I said something wrong. I'm not important enough to respond to. I'm being abandoned. This always happens. I'm fundamentally unlikable. Notice something crucial here. None of these thoughts are the situation. They're stories about the situation, narratives constructed by a mind that has learned to see threat, inadequacy, and rejection, even in the absence of any actual evidence. And then, because these thoughts feel so immediate, so obviously true, you experience the emotions that naturally arise from believing them. Anxiety, sadness, shame, despair. Not because of the unanswered text, but because of what your mind told you the unanswered text means. This is the error. This is what keeps you trapped. You're not responding to reality. You're responding to your distorted interpretation of reality. And you're doing it so automatically, so habitually, that you've merged the two into one undifferentiated experience. Beck spent decades demonstrating that this single mechanism underlies virtually all emotional suffering that isn't caused by immediate physical pain or genuine external threat. Depression, anxiety, rage, hopelessness, all of it emerges not from the world, but from systematic distortions in how you process information about the world. The brilliance of Beck's discovery wasn't just identifying that thoughts influence emotions. Philosophers had been saying that for millennia. His revolution was in cataloging the specific, predictable patterns of distortion that characterize dysfunctional thinking. He mapped the territory of cognitive errors with scientific precision, showing that minds in distress don't just think negatively. They think in identifiable, repetitive patterns that can be recognized, challenged, and ultimately transformed. He called these cognitive distortions, and understanding them is like suddenly being able to see the code running beneath your conscious awareness. All or nothing thinking takes continuous reality and splits it into absolute categories. You're either perfect or you're worthless. The interaction was either flawless or it was a complete disaster. There's no middle ground, no spectrum, no nuance. This distortion makes ordinary human imperfection feel like existential failure. You make one mistake and your mind declares total incompetence. Someone criticizes one aspect of your work and your mind interprets it as comprehensive rejection. The error here isn't just negativity. It's the elimination of the vast middle territory where actual human life occurs, where things are good enough, where growth happens through imperfection, where most experiences are mixed and complex rather than absolute. Overgeneralization takes a single event and transforms it into an eternal pattern. You fail once, and your mind declares you always fail. One person rejects you, and your mind concludes everyone will reject you. One business venture doesn't work, and your mind decides you're incapable of success. Notice the linguistic markers. Always, never, everyone, no one. These words erase the particular and replace it with the universal. Beck observed that depressed patients would experience one negative event and immediately extract from it a universal law about their nature and their future. The error isn't in noticing the negative event. It's in treating that single data point as if it contains absolute information about all future possibilities. Mental filtering is perhaps the most insidious distortion because it operates invisibly in the background of perception itself. Your mind selectively attends to information that confirms your existing negative beliefs while ignoring or dismissing anything that contradicts them. If you believe you're incompetent, you'll remember every mistake in vivid detail while forgetting or minimizing every success. If you believe people don't like you, you'll notice every ambiguous facial expression and interpret it as rejection while completely overlooking clear signs of affection or respect. This isn't conscious manipulation. It's how attention itself becomes distorted, creating a feedback loop where your beliefs shape what you notice, and what you notice reinforces your beliefs, until you're living in a subjective reality that bears less and less resemblance to what's actually occurring. Discounting the positive is the mechanism by which your mind maintains negative beliefs, even in the face of contradictory evidence. Someone compliments you, and your mind immediately explains it away. They're just being nice. They don't really mean it. They haven't seen the real me. They're easily impressed. Notice what's happening here. Evidence that contradicts your negative self-concept isn't integrated. It's rejected, minimized, or reinterpreted so that the original belief remains intact. Beck found that this distortion was particularly common in depression, where patients would systematically reject positive feedback while accepting negative feedback as obvious truth. The error isn't in being modest or realistic. It's in having a double standard for evidence, where negative information is accepted uncritically, while positive information must meet an impossibly high burden of proof. Jumping to conclusions manifests in two primary forms: mind reading and fortune telling. Mind reading is when you assume you know what others are thinking, usually something negative about you, without any actual evidence. She thinks I'm boring. He's judging me. They're disappointed in me. Fortune telling is when you predict negative outcomes with absolute certainty. This won't work. I'm going to fail. Nothing will ever change. Both distortions share a common feature. They treat speculation as fact. Your mind generates a hypothesis about what someone thinks or what will happen in the future, and then relates to that hypothesis as if it were established reality. The emotional consequences are identical to what you'd experience if your speculation were true, except you're suffering over something that exists only in your imagination. Magnification and minimization involve distorting the significance of events. Magnification takes negative events and inflates their importance until they become catastrophic. You make a minor social error and your mind declares it humiliating. You receive criticism and your mind interprets it as devastating. Minimization does the opposite with positive events, shrinking their significance until they become meaningless. You accomplish something substantial and your mind dismisses it as trivial or lucky. Someone expresses genuine care, and your mind reduces it to politeness. Together, these distortions create a warped lens where everything bad is enormous and everything good is insignificant, where your perception of reality becomes a funhouse mirror that reflects back only inadequacy and threat. Emotional reasoning is the distortion where you treat your feelings as evidence of truth. I feel anxious, therefore something bad is going to happen. I feel inadequate, therefore I am inadequate. I feel unloved, therefore I am unlovable. This error is particularly seductive because emotions feel so real, so immediate, so undeniable. But Beck's insight was that emotions, while valid as experiences, are not sources of information about objective reality. They're responses to your thoughts, which may or may not be accurate. When you engage in emotional reasoning, you're creating a closed loop where distorted thoughts generate negative emotions, and then those negative emotions are used as evidence that the distorted thoughts were correct. You're trapped in a self-confirming system where the error continuously validates itself. Should statements impose rigid rules about how you, others, and the world must be? I should be more productive. People should be fair. Life should be easier. These statements create suffering by measuring reality against an inflexible standard and then experiencing anger, guilt, or disappointment when reality inevitably fails to comply. Beck noticed that should statements often reflect internalized rules that were never consciously chosen, beliefs absorbed from family, culture, or past experience that now operate as absolute laws. The error isn't in having values or standards. It's in the rigidity, the demand that reality conform to your preferences, and the emotional suffering that arises when it doesn't. Should statements turn preferences into moral imperatives and then punish you or others for failing to meet them? Labeling is an extreme form of overgeneralization where instead of describing a behavior or outcome, you attach a global label to yourself or others. Instead of "I made a mistake," it becomes "I'm a failure." Instead of "he did something inconsiderate," it becomes "he's a terrible person." Labels are totalizing. They reduce the complexity of human experience to a single, usually negative, identity. Beck observed that once you've applied a label, it becomes a lens through which all subsequent behavior is interpreted. If you've labeled yourself as incompetent, every difficulty confirms the label. If you've labeled someone as untrustworthy, every ambiguous action is seen through that frame. The error is in replacing the particular with the absolute, in taking a slice of behavior and treating it as if it defines the totality of a person. Personalization involves taking responsibility for events that are outside your control, assuming that everything is somehow about you or caused by you. Your partner is in a bad mood and you assume it's because of something you did. Your child struggles in school and you conclude you're a bad parent. A project fails, and even though multiple factors were involved, you believe it's entirely your fault. This distortion creates a crushing sense of responsibility for outcomes you cannot actually control, leading to guilt, anxiety, and a constant sense of having failed. Beck found that personalization was often rooted in an inflated sense of control, where the mind prefers to believe you caused something negative rather than accepting the uncomfortable reality that many events are simply outside your influence. These distortions don't operate in isolation. They combine, reinforce each other, and create a comprehensive system of misinterpretation that can make moment-to-moment existence feel unbearable. What Beck discovered was that people suffering from depression, anxiety, and other forms of psychological distress weren't thinking slightly more negatively than others. They were thinking in fundamentally distorted ways, running every experience through a filter that systematically extracted evidence of danger, inadequacy, and hopelessness, while filtering out anything that contradicted that narrative. And they were doing it automatically, without awareness, thousands of times per day. The reason this matters, the reason this is the error that keeps you trapped in suffering, is that as long as these distortions operate beneath awareness, you experience their output as reality itself. You don't think "I'm having the thought that I'm worthless." You think "I am worthless." The thought and the reality have merged into one experience. And when you believe your distorted thoughts are accurate perceptions of reality, you can't challenge them. You can only suffer from them. This is the prison Beck identified, not the prison of circumstance, but the prison of unexamined interpretation. But here's where Beck's work becomes genuinely liberating. Once you learn to recognize these patterns in your own thinking, once you develop the capacity to step back from the immediate experience of a thought and examine its structure, you gain something transformative. You gain distance. You gain the ability to ask, is this thought accurate, or is it a distortion? What evidence supports this interpretation? What evidence contradicts it? Am I responding to what actually happened, or to what my mind told me it means? This process, which Beck formalized as cognitive restructuring, isn't about positive thinking or replacing negative thoughts with positive ones. It's about accuracy. It's about learning to see clearly rather than through the warped lens of habitual distortion. The practice begins with awareness. You have to start noticing your thoughts, particularly the automatic thoughts that arise in moments of emotional distress. This is harder than it sounds because these thoughts are so quick, so habitual, that they often occur beneath conscious awareness. You feel anxious and you assume the anxiety is a direct response to the situation. But if you slow down and pay attention, you'll discover there's a thought between the situation and the emotion. Someone gives you feedback and you feel terrible. But between the feedback and the feeling, there was a thought. I'm incompetent. I've disappointed them. I'm going to lose everything. The thought is what created the emotion, not the feedback itself. Once you've identified the thought, the next step is to examine it. Beck developed a series of questions that help reveal whether a thought is accurate or distorted. What evidence supports this thought? What evidence contradicts it? Am I confusing a thought with a fact? Am I jumping to conclusions? Am I thinking in all or nothing terms? Am I catastrophizing? What would I tell a friend who had this thought? Is there another way to interpret this situation? These questions aren't meant to convince you to think positively. They're meant to help you think accurately. Because when you examine distorted thoughts carefully, their lack of basis in reality becomes apparent. You realize you're not responding to what happened. You're responding to one possible interpretation among many, and usually not the most accurate one. The transformation that occurs through this practice isn't instantaneous, but it is profound. As you get better at recognizing and challenging distortions, you begin to experience a kind of freedom that isn't dependent on circumstances. You realize that suffering isn't imposed on you by external events. It's created by how you interpret those events, and interpretation is something you can examine, question, and ultimately change. This doesn't mean you'll never experience pain, or that life will become easy. It means you'll stop creating unnecessary suffering through distorted thinking. You'll stop torturing yourself with catastrophic predictions that never materialize. You'll stop treating one mistake as evidence of total inadequacy. You'll stop reading minds and then suffering from what you imagined others were thinking. You'll start responding to reality rather than to the distorted stories your mind tells about reality. Beck's insight reveals something about the nature of human suffering that most people never grasp. The majority of your misery isn't caused by what's actually happening in your life. It's caused by the layer of distorted interpretation you've placed over your life, the habitual patterns of negative thinking that have become so automatic they feel like reality itself. And this means that suffering, at least the kind created by cognitive distortion, is optional, not easy to eliminate, not something that disappears because you understand it intellectually, but optional in the sense that it's created by mental habits that can be identified, examined, and gradually transformed. This is why Beck's work is so crucial for anyone serious about understanding their own mind. It provides a map of exactly how you create your own suffering and a methodology for stopping. It shows you that you're not a passive victim of your emotions, helplessly buffeted by circumstances. You're an active participant in creating your emotional experience through the interpretations you make, most of which happen so quickly and automatically that you don't even realize you're making them. And once you see this, once you truly understand that your thoughts are not facts, that they're interpretations which may or may not be accurate, you gain access to a kind of freedom that transforms everything. The error that keeps you trapped isn't that you have negative experiences. It's that you automatically interpret those experiences through distorted patterns of thinking, and then treat those distorted interpretations as if they were objective truth. You suffer not from reality, but from your distorted perception of reality. And the moment you recognize this, the moment you develop the capacity to examine your thoughts rather than simply believing them, you've taken the first step toward a fundamentally different way of being. Not a life without difficulty or pain, but a life where you're no longer creating unnecessary suffering through unexamined patterns of distorted thinking. Beck proved through decades of research that changing these patterns of thinking changes emotional experience, not through willpower or positive affirmations, but through the patient work of learning to see clearly, to distinguish between what's actually happening and what your mind is telling you is happening. To recognize distortion when it arises and respond with questions rather than automatic belief. This is the path out of the prison of cognitive distortion, not escape into some fantasy of perpetual happiness, but liberation into accurate perception, where you respond to reality rather than to the distorted stories about reality that your mind has been telling you your entire life. The cognitive revolution Beck initiated wasn't just an advance in therapy. It was a revelation about human consciousness itself. It showed that the mind is not a passive mirror reflecting reality. It's an active interpreter, constantly generating meanings, predictions, and judgments, and that these interpretations can become systematically distorted in ways that create immense suffering. But it also showed that these distortions can be recognized, examined, and corrected. That suffering caused by distorted thinking can be reduced not by changing your circumstances, but by changing how you process your circumstances. This is the promise Beck's work offers. Freedom not from difficulty, but from the unnecessary suffering you create through habitual patterns of distorted thinking. The question now is whether you're willing to look at your own thinking with the same scrutiny Beck brought to his patients. Whether you're willing to question the thoughts that feel most obviously true, to examine the automatic interpretations that arise in moments of distress, to distinguish between what's actually happening and what your mind is telling you is happening. This isn't comfortable work. It requires you to challenge thoughts that have operated unchallenged for years, to sit with uncertainty rather than accepting the false certainty of distorted thinking, to trade the familiar pain of habitual distortion for the unfamiliar territory of accurate perception. But on the other side of that discomfort is something Beck demonstrated over and over in his clinical work: genuine relief, lasting change, and freedom from patterns of suffering that once seemed inevitable and unchangeable. Tentar novamente a partir deste título, crie texto totalmente e perfeitamente em inglês para meu canal no YouTube, com 5.000 palavras ou mais. O texto deve ser fluido, contínuo e sem marcações de tópicos que interrompam a narração. Comece fazendo uma pergunta paradoxal e falando o que a autoridade pensa sobre o assunto. Traga uma crença que a maioria das pessoas pensam e quebre essa ideia com uma informação muito interessante e faça uma promessa que fará a pessoa ficar até o fim do vídeo. Preciso que tudo esteja em plena sintonia com o tema do título. Utilize gatilhos de curiosidade fortes e interessantes para que a audiência permaneça até o final do vídeo. A intenção não é analisar a autoridade como um objeto, mas usá-los como um portal para o território que descrevem. O foco é o assunto em si, a experiência do despertar, para um público que já não precisa de introduções. O tom deve ser ajustado, sem metalinguagem, apenas imersão no tema. Mergulhe diretamente no assunto. A voz deve soar como a da própria autoridade, não a de um comentarista. O público já está no caminho e consome esse tipo de conteúdo. Então a narrativa deve prosseguir como uma emanação da autoridade, não como um comentário. Logo depois da intro, insira um CTA de inscrição breve, natural e persuasivo. Toda a narrativa deve ser emocional, persuasiva e profundamente ligada à filosofia prática da autoridade, conduzindo o espectador de forma crescente até uma conclusão impactante, que deixe no público a sensação de revelação e transformação. Segue o título do vídeo para você desenvolver todo o conteúdo a partir dele. Sua mente, mente. O exercício de 5 minutos de Aaron Beck para ver a verdade editar. Sua mente, mente. O exercício de 5 minutos de Aaron Beck para ver a verdade. What if the most convincing liar you'll ever encounter isn't another person, but your own mind? Aaron Beck spent 50 years documenting a disturbing reality. Your consciousness systematically deceives you, presenting distorted interpretations as objective facts. And you believe these deceptions so completely that you build your entire emotional life upon them. Most people assume their thoughts accurately reflect reality, that what they think about a situation is simply what's true about that situation. But Beck discovered something that changes everything. Between any event and your emotional response lies an invisible layer of interpretation, and this interpretation is almost always distorted in predictable, identifiable ways. And here's what will keep you watching. By the end of this, you'll have a precise 5-minute exercise that exposes these distortions in real time, allowing you to see the difference between what's actually happening and what your mind is telling you is happening. And that distinction is the difference between suffering and freedom. If you're ready to stop being manipulated by your own thinking and want practical tools that actually work, subscribe now and stay connected to content that cuts through illusion and gets to what transforms your experience from the inside out. Your mind lies to you every single day, multiple times per hour, and it does so with such conviction that you never question it. The lie isn't random. It follows patterns so consistent that Beck was able to catalog them with scientific precision. Understanding that your mind distorts reality isn't enough. You need a method for catching these distortions as they occur, a way to interrupt the automatic process by which interpretation masquerades as truth. This is what the 5-minute exercise provides, a systematic approach to examining your thoughts rather than simply believing them, a practice that creates space between stimulus and response, between what happens and what you tell yourself it means. The exercise itself is deceptively simple, but its effects are profound. When you notice yourself experiencing a strong negative emotion, anxiety, anger, sadness, shame, you stop. You don't try to change the emotion. You don't suppress it or reason it away. You simply pause and ask yourself one question. What thought just went through my mind? This is harder than it sounds because most of your thinking happens so quickly, so automatically, that it bypasses conscious awareness entirely. You feel terrible, and you assume the feeling is a direct response to what's happening around you. But if you slow down and pay attention, you'll discover there's always a thought between the event and the emotion. Always. Your colleague doesn't acknowledge you in the hallway, and you feel hurt. But between their behavior and your hurt, there was a thought. They're angry at me. I did something wrong. They don't respect me. That thought, not the behavior itself, created the emotional response. This is the first revelation the exercise provides. Thoughts aren't emotions, and events aren't thoughts. There are three distinct layers operating in every moment of distress. The external event, which is neutral and contains no inherent meaning. The thought, which is your mind's interpretation of what that event means. And the emotion, which is your response to the thought, not to the event. Most people collapse these three layers into one undifferentiated experience. Something happens, you feel bad, and you assume the bad feeling is caused directly by what happened. But Beck's insight was that the event doesn't cause the emotion. The thought about the event causes the emotion. And thoughts, unlike events, can be examined, questioned, and changed. Once you've identified the thought, the exercise moves to the second question. What type of distortion is this? Beck mapped 13 primary patterns of cognitive distortion, and learning to recognize them is like suddenly being able to see the code running beneath your conscious experience. Is this all or nothing thinking, where you're splitting reality into absolute categories with no middle ground? Is it overgeneralization, where you're taking one event and declaring it represents an eternal pattern? Is it mental filtering, where you're selectively attending only to information that confirms your negative belief? Is it mind reading, where you're assuming you know what others think without evidence? Is it fortune telling, where you're predicting negative outcomes with false certainty? Is it catastrophizing, where you're magnifying the significance of a negative event until it becomes unbearable? Is it emotional reasoning, where you're treating your feelings as evidence of truth? The power of naming the distortion cannot be overstated. When you simply notice a negative thought, it still feels true. Your mind generated it. It feels immediate and compelling, and your first instinct is to believe it. But when you identify the specific pattern of distortion operating, something shifts. You realize this isn't an accurate perception of reality. It's a predictable error your mind makes, one you've made countless times before, one that follows a recognizable pattern. The thought loses its authority. It goes from feeling like obvious truth to revealing itself as a habitual distortion. And in that recognition, you gain distance. You're no longer merged with the thought. You're observing it, examining it, relating to it as an object of awareness rather than as reality itself. The third question strikes at the heart of the distortion. What evidence supports this thought, and what evidence contradicts it? This is where most people discover how flimsy their negative thoughts actually are when examined carefully. You think your colleague is angry at you because they didn't say hello. What's the evidence? They didn't acknowledge you in the hallway. That's it. That's the entire foundation for your conclusion about their emotional state and their feelings toward you. Now, what's the evidence against it? They've been friendly every other interaction you've had. They might not have seen you. They might have been preoccupied with something urgent. They might have been lost in thought. They've never given any indication of being angry. There's literally no evidence they're upset except for one ambiguous moment that your mind immediately interpreted negatively. Notice what happens when you examine thoughts this way. They don't hold up. The certainty you felt evaporates. You realize you've been suffering over an interpretation that has almost no basis in reality, that you constructed an entire narrative from one neutral event and then related to that narrative as if it were established fact. This is what your mind does constantly, and the exercise exposes it. Not occasionally, not in extreme cases, constantly. Every strong negative emotion you experience is preceded by a thought that, when examined, reveals itself to be either completely unsupported by evidence or dramatically overstated. You're not responding to reality. You're responding to your distorted interpretation of reality, and the exercise shows you the gap between the two. The fourth question introduces alternative interpretations. What are other possible ways to understand this situation? This question is crucial because it breaks the illusion that your initial interpretation is the only possible reading of events. Your mind generates one interpretation, usually negative, and presents it with such immediacy that you don't even realize other interpretations exist. But there are always alternatives. Always. Your colleague didn't say hello. Possible interpretations. They're angry at me. They didn't see me. They were distracted. They're dealing with something difficult. They were in a hurry. They're socially awkward. They assumed I'd seen them and didn't want to interrupt my thoughts. Every one of these interpretations is equally consistent with the available evidence, but only one of them causes suffering. Your mind chose the one that confirms your negative beliefs and presented it as obvious truth, and you accepted it without question. Generating alternative interpretations does something profound to your relationship with your thoughts. It reveals that thinking isn't passive perception, it's active construction. Your mind doesn't simply register what's happening. It selects certain details, ignores others, and weaves them into a narrative that reflects your underlying beliefs, fears, and assumptions. And because this process happens automatically, you experience its output as reality rather than as one possible interpretation among many. The exercise interrupts this automaticity. It forces you to consciously acknowledge that your first interpretation is just that, an interpretation, and that other equally valid readings of the same event exist. This doesn't mean all interpretations are equally true. It means your automatic interpretation isn't necessarily accurate just because it feels immediate and compelling. The fifth question is perhaps the most powerful. What would I tell a friend who had this exact thought in this exact situation? This question exploits a fascinating asymmetry Beck observed in human thinking. People are much harsher and more distorted in their thinking about themselves than they are when thinking about others. You make a mistake and you conclude you're incompetent. Your friend makes the same mistake and you see it as a normal human error that anyone could make. You interpret ambiguous social situations involving yourself in the most negative possible way. When a friend describes the same situation, you immediately see more balanced explanations. This double standard reveals that your negative thoughts about yourself aren't based on objective reality. They're based on cognitive biases that specifically target your self-perception. When you ask what you'd tell a friend, you temporarily step outside your habitual patterns of self-criticism and gain access to a more balanced perspective. You realize you'd never tell a friend the harsh things your mind tells you. You'd point out that they're catastrophizing, or overgeneralizing, or being too hard on themselves. You'd offer perspective, remind them of evidence they're ignoring, question whether they're really seeing the situation clearly. The exercise asks you to offer yourself the same compassion and rationality you'd extend to someone you care about, not by forcing positive thinking, but by applying the same standards of evidence and reasoning to your own thoughts that you'd naturally apply when helping someone else examine theirs. These 5 questions constitute the complete exercise, and they take approximately 5 minutes when you're first learning the practice. Identify the thought underlying your negative emotion. Name the distortion operating. Examine the evidence for and against the thought. Generate alternative interpretations. Ask what you'd tell a friend with this thought. That's it. 5 questions that systematically dismantle the authority of distorted thinking and reveal the gap between your interpretation and reality. But understanding the exercise intellectually is completely different from practicing it, and the practice is where transformation occurs. You have to actually do this, repeatedly, in moments of real distress, when your mind is generating thoughts that feel absolutely true and your emotions are intense. That's when the exercise has power. That's when you discover experientially that your thoughts are not facts, that your mind systematically lies to you, and that you have the capacity to examine these lies rather than automatically believing them. The resistance you'll encounter when you start practicing this exercise reveals something important about how deeply invested you are in your distorted thinking. Your mind doesn't want to be examined. It wants its interpretations accepted as reality. When you start questioning your thoughts, you'll notice your mind has sophisticated defenses. It will tell you this exercise is pointless, that your situation is different, that this particular thought really is true even if others weren't. It will generate feelings of certainty so strong that questioning the thought feels absurd. It will bring up evidence that seems to support the distortion while conveniently forgetting evidence that contradicts it. This resistance is actually proof that you're doing something significant. You're challenging patterns of thinking that have operated unchallenged for years, possibly decades. Of course there's resistance. You're threatening the entire system by which your mind has been operating. But here's what happens if you persist with the practice. The distortions don't disappear immediately, but they begin to lose their power. You start catching them earlier, sometimes even before the emotion fully develops. You recognize the feeling of a distorted thought, the quality of false certainty it carries, the way it collapses complexity into absolute categories, and instead of being swept away by it, instead of accepting it as truth and experiencing all the emotional consequences that follow, you pause, you examine, you question. And in that space between thought and belief, between interpretation and acceptance, freedom emerges. Not freedom from having negative thoughts. You'll always have negative thoughts. It's part of being human. But freedom from being controlled by them, from treating them as accurate perceptions of reality, from building your entire emotional life on foundations that crumble the moment you examine them carefully. Beck discovered through decades of clinical work that this practice, consistently applied, produces measurable changes in emotional well-being, not because it makes you think positively, but because it makes you think accurately. When you stop responding to distorted interpretations and start responding to reality as it actually is, your emotional experience changes. Not because reality becomes easier, but because you're no longer adding layers of unnecessary suffering created by catastrophizing, overgeneralizing, mind reading, and all the other systematic errors your mind makes. You still experience pain when genuinely painful things happen. You still feel sadness and frustration and disappointment, but you stop torturing yourself with distorted thoughts about these experiences. You stop taking one difficult moment and turning it into evidence of permanent inadequacy. You stop predicting catastrophes that never materialize. You stop treating your anxious feelings as proof that something terrible is about to happen. The transformation isn't about becoming emotionless or detached. It's about becoming accurate. It's about learning to see what's actually in front of you, rather than seeing through the distorted lens of habitual negative thinking. And this accuracy has profound practical consequences. When you're not wasting energy on suffering created by distorted thoughts, that energy becomes available for dealing with actual problems. When you're not paralyzed by catastrophic predictions, you can take action based on realistic assessment of situations. When you're not consumed by mind reading and personalization, you can engage with people based on what they actually say and do, rather than on what you imagine they're thinking. The exercise doesn't just reduce suffering. It increases effectiveness, capability, and genuine connection with reality. What makes this practice so valuable is that it's completely portable. You don't need a therapist. You don't need any equipment or special circumstances. You just need 5 minutes and a willingness to examine your thoughts when you notice strong negative emotions. You can practice it anywhere, anytime you notice yourself feeling disproportionately upset about something. And the more you practice, the more automatic it becomes. Eventually, the examination of thoughts happens almost as quickly as the thoughts themselves arise. You have a negative thought. You immediately recognize the pattern of distortion. You question it naturally rather than believing it automatically. And you respond based on accurate assessment rather than distorted interpretation. This is what Beck meant by cognitive restructuring. Not replacing negative thoughts with positive ones, but developing the capacity to examine thoughts rather than simply believing them, to distinguish between interpretation and reality, to catch distortions as they arise and respond with questions rather than automatic acceptance. The deepest insight the exercise provides isn't about any particular thought. It's about the nature of thinking itself. You discover through direct experience that thoughts are events in consciousness, not truths about reality. They arise, they have certain qualities, they generate emotions, but they're not inherently more real or true than any other mental event. A thought that says you're worthless has exactly the same ontological status as a thought about what to have for dinner. Both are just mental events, interpretations, constructions. The difference is that you've learned to treat certain thoughts, particularly negative thoughts about yourself, as if they have special access to truth, as if they're revealing something fundamental about reality. But they're not. They're just thoughts, generated by a mind that follows predictable patterns, many of which are systematically distorted. This realization is genuinely liberating because it means you're not trapped by your thinking. You can't control what thoughts arise. That process is largely automatic, shaped by genetics, past experience, current circumstances, and countless other factors outside your direct control. But you can control how you relate to thoughts once they've arisen. You can examine them rather than believing them. You can question them rather than accepting them. You can recognize distortions rather than treating them as accurate perceptions. And in that capacity to relate differently to your thoughts lies the possibility of a fundamentally different quality of life. Not a life where everything goes your way and you never experience difficulty, but a life where you're not constantly creating unnecessary suffering through unexamined patterns of distorted thinking. The exercise Beck developed isn't just a therapeutic technique. It's a practice of seeing clearly, of distinguishing between what's actually happening and what your mind tells you is happening. And this distinction, simple as it sounds, is the foundation of psychological freedom. Because once you can see the difference between reality and your interpretation of reality, once you can catch your mind in the act of distorting, once you can question thoughts rather than automatically believing them, you've broken the primary mechanism by which suffering is created. Not all suffering. There's genuine pain in life that no amount of cognitive work eliminates. But the suffering created by distorted thinking, which Beck demonstrated constitutes the majority of emotional distress most people experience, becomes optional, not easy to eliminate, not something that happens just because you understand it intellectually, but optional in the sense that it's created by mental habits that can be recognized, examined, and gradually transformed through patient practice. What's required is radical honesty about your own thinking. You have to be willing to acknowledge that your mind lies to you, that your most convincing thoughts are often the most distorted, that the feelings of certainty you experience are not reliable guides to truth. This honesty is difficult because it means surrendering the false security of treating your interpretations as facts. It means living with more uncertainty, more openness, more willingness to question. But on the other side of that discomfort is something Beck spent his entire career demonstrating: genuine relief, lasting change, and freedom from patterns of suffering that once seemed inevitable. The 5-minute exercise is the doorway to that freedom. Not a magic solution that makes everything instantly better, but a practice that, consistently applied, fundamentally changes your relationship with your own mind and, through that change, transforms your entire experience of being alive. Your mind will continue to lie to you. That's what minds do. They generate interpretations, many of which are distorted. But you no longer have to believe these lies. You have a method for examining them, for exposing the gap between interpretation and reality, for responding based on accurate assessment rather than habitual distortion. And that method, practiced consistently, is the difference between being controlled by your thinking and being free to examine it, between suffering from distorted interpretation and responding to reality as it actually is. This is the gift Beck's work offers. Not the elimination of negative thoughts, but the capacity to examine them. And in that examination, the possibility of a life no longer imprisoned by the systematic distortions your mind has been presenting as truth for as long as you can remember.